To help us examine the impact the next president will have not just on America, but on the whole world, we are joined in Washington, D.C. by Malou Innocent, foreign policy analyst with the Cato Institute. In Edmonton, Alberta, Wenren Jiang, senior fellow at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. And with us here in studio, Paul Heinbecker, former Canadian ambassador to the United Nations. Don Abelson, director of the Centre for American Studies at Western University in London, Ontario. And Jeffrey Kopstein, director of the Centre for Jewish Studies at the University of Toronto. And it's great to have you three here in our studio, and to our friends in Points Beyond, welcome to the agenda. I want to start by reading an excerpt of Peter Beinert's from the Daily Beast from earlier this summer, where he writes, by conventional benchmarks, Barack Obama's Middle East policy has been quite successful. He's killed Osama bin Laden and many other top al-Qaeda leaders. With Europe's help, he's imposed crushing sanctions on Iran. He's successfully withdrawn troops from Iraq. According to polls, foreign policy is among his greatest political strengths. Let's start here. We're going to go through the various files, if you like, that are on the president's desk and talk about whether he or Mitt Romney would be better for the world. And so, Jeffrey, get us started. How is Obama regarded in the Arab world after almost 4 years in power?
A bit of ambivalence. On the one hand, he started his presidency with, you'll remember, a speech in Cairo, where he promised to kind of remake relations with the Muslim world. And then, of course, he went to Istanbul and gave a speech before the Turkey's parliament, where he basically promised the same thing again. But then the real test came when the Arab Street kind of exploded in the Arab awakening with the overthrow of Mubarak.
Did he pass the test?
Well, it was ambivalence, because at first they sided with the regime and very slowly backed away from the regime and finally said Mubarak's got to go. And so the Arab Street is still rather distrustful. Then in Libya, right, after having a period of great restraint in Egypt, right, in Libya they sided with the opposition, right, and helped overthrow Gaddafi. Now comes Syria. Right? And they're playing a very careful and tricky game with Istanbul's help, siding with the kind of people who would overthrow Assad without actually bringing to power a regime which could be a lot worse. And so they're in a position now, I think, of great ambivalence in the Arab world. Are they going to appeal to the Arab Street, the things that the Arab Street might want, without overthrowing the traditional allies in the region of Israel, Saudi Arabia, and other non-democratic regimes in the Gulf states?
Malou Innocent, you're there in Washington, D.C. How do you think Barack Obama is regarded in the Arab world?
I would agree with the previous speaker. I think it has been largely ambivalence. There was also a great deal of expectation and excitement when he was running for office and when he was finally in the Oval Office. But I think the negatives are against him in many respects. In one respect, although he did withdraw U.S. troops from Iraq as he promised and as Americans wanted, he's also tripled the number of troops in Afghanistan. He's increased and expanded the number of drone strikes in neighboring Pakistan. He's expanded them beyond the traditional battlefields of Iraq and Afghanistan into Yemen and Somalia. And so this has really been an irritant in the Arab world and in the broader Muslim world. And as we've seen recently with the attacks on the U.S. embassies and consulates in 25 various Muslim states, there's a palpable anger, not just with Obama, but also with broader U.S. policies. And these were these were events that were triggered also by a video, of course, but also by a militant Islamic extremism that's also been sort of whipped up with the increased militarization of U.S. policy. And I think on this point, what sort of troubles me most about President Obama's foreign policy is that he's really embraced many of the most hawkish aspects of the Bush administration's policies, and yet at the same time he's condemned as being weak and bumbling by many Republicans within Washington. So this almost serves to shift the foreign policy goalpost in Washington further to the right and in a way that actually becomes detrimental to America's long-term interests.
Let me get Paul Heinbecker's view on that. Do you think he has retained some of the most muscular, if you like, policies from the Bush years?
Well, he clearly has, insofar as getting rid of bin Laden is the one thing he's done. The drone attacks in Pakistan have decapitated a large part of al-Qaeda. He's taken a very tough line, a tougher line, I would say, on Pakistan. Same thing for Yemen. Same thing in the Red Sea area. He's a stronger president, and I think he's given credit for. And we saw some clarity in the debate between Biden and Ryan. Biden made very clear that they were not going to go further, that they were out of Iraq, they were getting out of Afghanistan when they said they would get out of Afghanistan, and they were not going to be putting troops in Syria. It was a very clear-cut statement. And I think that from the point of view of the Arab Spring, we're beginning to see something else, and that is that the countries that used to not want the United States to intervene now do want the United States to intervene. There was a recent resolution in the UN General Assembly, and it was supported by Libya, by Tunisia, and by Egypt for the first time ever, talking about the outside world taking a stronger hand in what was going on in Syria.
Let me go across the table here to Don Abelson and also go across the floor to the Republican side of the equation. Mitt Romney, how do you think he is viewed in the Middle East at the moment?
Well, certainly in Israel, I think there are a lot of people who would view his candidacy as being fairly favorable. I mean, he gave a speech a few days ago at the Virginia Military Institute. He indicated unequivocally that the United States would never betray its most ardent ally in the Middle East, Israel. And I think he played on a narrative that has been circulating for some time, that the Obama administration over several months has distanced itself from Benjamin Netanyahu and from the Israeli government. So I think for many in Israel, particularly those that support Likud, I don't think they would flinch in having Mitt Romney. Now the problem is, clearly he has to get up to speed on the complexities of the Middle East, but I think he would be seen as a staunch ally.
There's a difference between distancing himself from and betraying.
Yes.
Do you think Obama has betrayed Israel?
I don't believe so. I don't believe so. But again, that's one narrative that has been evolving for some time. I think Joe Biden, going back to the point that Paul made last night in the vice presidential debate,
Thursday night, we should say.
Sorry,
last
Thursday
night.
Biden made it very, very clear that the relationship between Barack Obama and Benjamin Netanyahu couldn't be stronger. They both have a common foe, and that's in Iran and Iran's willingness to try and acquire nuclear capability. So no, I don't believe that Barack Obama has betrayed Israel, but there has been some friction, and that has been picked up on by a number of observers.
Let's go to Western Canada. Wenren Jiang, how much appetite do you see among the countries of the Middle East for the United States to get more deeply involved in Syria?
Well, there are some individual governments, as previous speaker mentioned, may wanted the United States to get a little bit closer to the Middle Eastern or even into their own countries. But these are the regimes now are supposed to be closer and friendlier to the United States. But overall, if you look at the past 4 years, the record of U.S. policy, President Obama or U.S. As a whole in the Middle East, structural fundamental issues, none of them have been resolved. The United States may have done a few things, winning a few battles, such as killing Osama bin Laden, but the overall war, if they call it a war against the terror or whatever in that region, or the war especially on the public opinion by the Arab world, the United States is not getting anywhere close to be recovering. In fact, the United States didn't really know how to respond to the Arab Spring, and the foreign policy area is messy at the moment on how to direct itself and get its image through. Another dimension nobody mentioned so far is that the U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, intervention in Libya and in now Syria, opened up another front, confrontational, hostile in a sense, tense with both Russia and China. So these are the structural global issues that United States next president, Obama or Romney, they must be dealing with.
Well, let me follow up with Ambassador Heimbecker here. If let's accept his premise that he thinks on many of the major issues of the Middle East there hasn't been very much, if any, progress at all. Do we assume there would be more under a Romney presidency?
I wouldn't accept the premise, but no. In fact, what we're seeing from Romney the Romney speech on foreign policy, as somebody said, sounded like Bush but read like Obama. The whole notion, we're seeing a lot of neocon talk, what I like to call zombie cons, people that we thought were dead who've come back from the Bush administration. It's all about power, it's all about leadership, it's all about America's place in the world. And it's being headed by a guy whose experience in the world is going door to door in Paris, proselytizing on behalf of his religion. I would rather have a guy as president.
That's Romney you're talking
about. That's Romney. I'd rather have a guy as president who grew up whose father was an African, who grew up in Indonesia, and whose formative years were spent in Hawaii, which is sort of the most multicultural of U.S. states. There's a guy with a lot of experience. Because the idea that the Americans can somehow go back to where they were and dominate everything, first of all, is a bad reading of history. But secondly, it's a bad reading of reality. This is a changed world. And there are a lot of people in the United States who would like to do less. They don't think the U.S. needs a bigger defense policy. They think the U.S. needs a smaller foreign policy.
But I'll follow up with Jeff on that. That comes from an assumption that, well, on the Republican side of the things, they think Obama's been weak. They think America needs a more muscular foreign policy and that the world is waiting for that. Are they right about that?
Only in part. It's true, this is a broader issue of kind of global order. The world today, since the end of the Cold War, it's no longer the US and the Soviet Union divvying up everything. But the question is, what is going to be the principle of that order? A lot of countries in the world would want the world to be run according to international institutions. Things get done on the basis of consensus, of voting in the UN, and other international organizations. But the fact of the matter is that the United States, today in the world, it's the operating system of the world. It's the Windows, right? And a lot of us don't like Windows because every once in a while you get the blue screen of death and you scream at your computer. But the fact of the matter is there's nothing really to replace it, right? There's nothing really to replace it. And until there's a kind of an alternative principle of order, even the international institutions that we have out there today, they don't really work unless the United States pushes. Right? And so as much as we might like the United Nations, as much as we might like other international institutions, the United States and kind of US power and purpose are really behind all of those. So on the one hand, as Ambassador Heinbecker said, there's a great deal of ambivalence about American power out there. On the other hand, there's no real alternative to it. And it's an order that the United States provides, and that, I might add, we all benefit from.
Let me get Malou Innocent to comment on that. Do you share the view that the Obama foreign policy has been weakish and that Romney can bring a more muscular approach that obviously he believes is necessary?
Well, Governor Romney has certainly talked a great game in terms of the blustery rhetoric, the chest thumping, the fist pumping, this sort of notion that America must have a muscular foreign policy and should not be shaped by the mercy of world events. But I think as far as America's role in the Middle East is concerned, the last 10 years and now 11 years have shown that many of the world's most pressing problems can't be dealt with by exclusively military means. And I think Syria is an excellent example of this. Certainly, we've focused on President Obama's authorizing logistical and intelligence support to, say, the Saudi Arabian government and that of the Qatari government, who in turn support their own Islamist proxies. But behind the scenes, and something that's not really examined that much, is the extent to which the Obama administration has been trying to increase the political coordination among the Syrian rebels, trying to inspire greater support from among the more responsible and more moderate elements, trying to encourage the rebels to embrace the minority groups and to embrace minority rights, because that's really the critical question for a lot of these regions around the world, and especially in the Middle East. How do you bring about political reconciliation, especially for a country like Syria, and how in a post-Assad Syria would we see a more inclusive vision where Alawites are not massacred or there is not retribution? The political issue is the most critical and something that we have yet to grapple with.
Don, I'm going to read you a couple of quotes here. I want you to tell me which one is closer to the mark. Mitt Romney said in a speech, "Hope is not a strategy," talking about foreign policy. The New York Times' Tom Friedman came back with, "Attitude is not a strategy." Who's closer to the mark?
Well, I think its attitude is not a strategy. One of the things that Mitt Romney is going to learn in the event that he is elected, and we're still weeks away from that, so who knows what's going to happen, is that foreign policy is very different from domestic policy. And as Ambassador Heinbecker pointed out, it's not simply a question of the United States outlining its strategy and imposing it on a foreign country. I think they've come to the realization that that simply doesn't work. What they need to do is to temper their objectives with the political reality of the day. And it doesn't help for Mitt Romney or a Paul Ryan to go on national television indicating that they wouldn't be prepared to work with the United Nations, that they would be prepared to engage in unilateral action. It's the kind of attitude that got us into trouble during 8 years of the Bush administration. So the United States has to realize what its limitations are. It has to understand what its political objectives are, and it has to make sure it's pursuing the right course of action.
Let me go to Wenren Zhang on that. Do you think there's too much hope in the Obama strategy and too much attitude in the Romney strategy?
I think there was too much hope in the Obama strategy in the beginning. It's not that long ago. People tend to forget. Remember, yes, we can. Hope, that was the theme. Domestically and internationally, 4 years ago, there was huge expectations for Obama. And Obama strategically, on his foreign policy as a new president, reoriented towards a much softer tone towards the Middle East, towards Iran, North Korea, including China. And that was his strategic orientation when he became president. But I think what happened since then has been that he's really very much preoccupied by the very messy domestic economic downturn that's not recovering. It hurt him and it took resources away. So those original, very hope-oriented, large strategic thinking faded, gave away to the kind of event by event, Arab Spring, Middle East crisis, Asia. So now you can see by the end of the first 4 years of Obama presidency, you see very event-oriented, response-oriented kind of strategy rather than grand strategy. So again, if Romney coming in, there will be a reorientation on the strategic level. But I think Obama may still have to think about his policy if he comes back into office again.
Paul Heimbecker.
Yeah, I think I disagree in this respect. When Obama came to office, both he and Hillary Clinton were at pains to say that the world had changed. Obviously, we had the emerging powers, the BRICS. Russia was still a factor. Japan was still a factor. It wasn't going to be the world it was before. It was going to be a world that had to work through multilateral cooperation. Not only multilateral cooperation, minilateral cooperation, messy multilateralism, but it was going to be a world in which the United States would be preeminent, but it wouldn't be predominant as it has been. And I think that is still the leitmotif of the Obama administration. If you read what Hillary Clinton has been saying lately, that's pretty much exactly where she is. She's talking about smart power, which is some variant between hard power and soft power. But she's talking about smart power, working with people, getting them to have the same agenda you have, trying to persuade them to have the same objectives you have, multiplying your influence by having everybody else join it. And the best example, I guess you could say, is Iran and the sanctions issue, in which the United States has all of the international community virtually largely united behind the sanctions on Iran, and they're being pretty effective.
And yet it's not good enough for Romney.
It's not good enough for Romney, who said that he would never allow daylight to open between the United States and Israel. But that, is a pretty big hostage to fortune, because that means whatever Netanyahu says, that's what the United States says. And I would think that the American population, the American government, is going to be more comfortable with a situation in which they're making their own judgments about when to go to war than when they're being made in Tel Aviv.
Jeff.
I mean, the problem is that Romney's only real strategy here is to try to out-hawk Obama. And the problem with that strategy is that the American public, now all the opinion polls show this, and even the Israeli public, is not really in the mood for a war. And so it's really hard for him to kind of out-hawk Obama. But I wanted to just roll it back for 1 second. I mean, we have to put this in some perspective. And that is that I think Obama's original strategy when he became president was to try to minimize the gigantic and huge and unsustainable foreign policy costs that the Bush administration had occurred. What he wants to do is to minimize foreign policy costs in order to pursue the domestic policy agenda. That's what Obama cares about. As a matter of fact, that's what most presidents care about in their first term.
But then events happen.
Events happen, and he's found himself unable to do that. And so their preferred strategy then, if they can't just concentrate only on domestic politics, their preferred strategy is to kind of outsource as much of foreign policy as they possibly can. But even that is not possible for the reasons I said in my last comment,
Sure.
and that's because nothing really happens unless the United States does it.
Well, let me pick up with Malou Innocent on that. Regardless of who is president on January the 20th, is there any reason to expect that there will be any progress on the Palestinian-Israeli question in the Middle East?
Oh, actually, I'd like to just skip right back. I'm so sorry. But on the issue of Iran, I think something that wasn't brought up, and I hope it will be discussed possibly more in depth in the program, is the counterproductive nature of the sort of more bullish, more blustery rhetoric from both Obama and Romney. While they differ on certain points when it comes to the red line with Iran in terms of their nuclear program, Obama's red line is that they want to prevent Iran from taking steps to a nuclear weapon, whereas Governor Romney has said his red line is Iran even pursuing a nuclear program, period. We must step back and understand that both candidates really do agree mostly on Iran, that Iran should not have a nuclear weapon. Both want to isolate Iran diplomatically. Both are for harsh sanctions on the Iranian central bank. Both candidates invoke very blustery and very provocative rhetoric against the Iranian regime. And the problem with that is that it's inherently counterproductive, because former U.S. and Israeli military and intelligence officials have said that the repercussions would be devastating for the entire region. There would be a widespread conflagration across across the region. Also, an attack would deny but not ultimately eliminate a nuclear program. It would also bring about a great deal of nationalist fervor. It would unite a very divided country. So we need to talk about the implications of a possible U.S. or Israeli attack, because I think that's really one issue that, number one, hasn't really been discussed all that much and could be incredibly crippling to the global economy and to U.S. position in the Middle East.
Well, okay, let me follow up on that then. Don, do you agree that there really isn't a thimbles full of difference between Romney and Obama on the issue of what to do on Iran?
I think on Iran, they have a very similar perspective, that they do not want Iran to acquire nuclear capability. Now, how they would react in the months before that could happen, we'll have to wait and see. But they cannot tolerate Iran with an unstable regime having their hands on a nuclear weapon. Getting to the point that your guest just made, I absolutely agree that the implications would be crippling to the international community and to the global economy.
If an attack took place.
If an attack took place. But having said that, in the event that Iran at some point does acquire a nuclear weapon, you cannot blame countries for wanting to defend themselves. And so the discussion that we might end up having is about what is the possibility of having a preemptive strike. Go back to the Bush years and talk about the Bush doctrine and preemption. Do you actually have to wait? If someone's coming toward you with a baseball bat, you actually have to wait for them to swing it. So one would hope that sanctions would work. One hopes that pressure from the international community will work. But in the event that Iran does acquire a nuclear weapon, I suspect the United States and Israel will have to work very closely together in order to minimize that threat.
Paul.
Yeah, I think that under the pressure of Netanyahu, the Americans have gone further than they probably should have gone. They've taken the tool of containment off the table. Containment is what we did vis-a-vis the Soviet Union all of those years when they were threatening to bury us, when the Soviet Union was run by Joseph Stalin, the biggest monster, with perhaps one exception, Hitler, of all time. So now we're talking about Iran, and all of a sudden it becomes intolerable. We can't possibly live with this. We're living with Korea having nuclear weapons. We're living with Pakistan having nuclear weapons. But we would start a war in the Middle East, in the cauldron of the Middle East, which will affect oil prices, economies, ethnicities, religious turmoil. We would contemplate that only because they're getting a nuclear capability. I don't think, to my mind, you have to think twice or three times about that.
Jeff?
Well, containment's possible. It is possible. It would, but I wouldn't minimize how much that would change. It would really change everything in the Middle East. It would not simply be a matter of does Israel have second strike capability? Could Israel actually change its policy of ambiguity? They would have to announce that they actually do have nuclear submarines, and that's one thing. But there's another thing that's equally as big. How about the ability for Iran to protect its proxy, to let's say, cast the nuclear shield over its proxies? That would change in Hezbollah, Hamas. That would really change an awful lot. I'm not saying they can't go there, but in some ways, they're damned if they do and damned if they don't.
That makes it different from North Korea, though, for example.
Very different. I agree with you that a policy of containment is possible. I don't think it's optimal, and I think the path that all sides have agreed on now, that is pursuing sanctions, trying to actually ratchet them up as much as possible, and of course the Israelis are pressing on their side to do even more. That's probably that's the sweet spot. That's the right way to go. I don't think just retreating to a policy of containment, and with the Cold War analogy is, I just don't think exact, and it's not going to work out exactly.
Let me get Don.
And if it doesn't work?
Sorry?
No, let me hear from Don first, and then we'll go to Wenran in Edmonton.
No, of course, one would prefer to contain Iran, and I think steps have been taken to do that as much as they possibly can. But in the event that you have a situation where you have an unstable regime that has announced on more than one occasion its intention to destroy another sovereign country, at what point do you stop taking them seriously?
But let's bring it back to home base here, which is Romney, Obama. Does it matter in terms
I don't think
of who's
so.
in the White House? No,
I don't think
they're both
so.
going to approach it the same way.
I believe they will.
Wenran, what's your view on that?
Well, I think as I listen to our colleagues discussing this, it's just very similar to the debate before Iraq. Remember this, we need to have some assessment issues here, not to be carried away. How far away really is Iran to the nuclear bomb? How much nuclear materials they have? What other missile technologies they could acquire? I mean, there's a huge debate going on. I think we should try to think about this not long ago that we had this Iraq fiasco. You don't want to repeat that. I think it's important to keep that in mind.
Okay, let's do, just before we leave this section about the Middle East, I do want Malou Innocent, if you could come in and just give us some of the basics on whether you believe if it's Romney, if it's Obama, anything will change on the Palestinian-Israeli issue.
Unfortunately, I'm not that hopeful. Just sadly, just looking at the past several decades of U.S. policy in the Middle East, there's been not a great deal of progress on a peace process. But I think also when you look back at, say, like the 1978-1979 Camp David Peace Accord, the United States has really supported Israel to a great extent and not necessarily as sort of accepted the notion of a sovereign Palestinian state. There are many historical and political reasons for that to be the case. Number one being America's strong support for a Jewish state in Palestine. But unfortunately, I don't see any sort of long-term progress either in terms of budging the Israelis to concede to a Palestinian state and also getting Palestine to accept the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine. And that's even on top of the problems within Washington of getting the political will necessary to bring forward sort of a territories for peace exchange between the two parties.
Jeffrey, last word on this?
Do I think there'll be any difference between?
Right.
Probably not. Romney toyed with the idea of getting rid of a two-state solution in one of his earlier speeches, but then he quickly backed off of that and said he's with the consensus that there should be a two-state solution in the Middle East. Whether or not anybody's actually going to do anything about that at this point remains to be seen.
Okay. Let me move us on to Chapter 2 of our discussion, if you like, and that is America as the hegemonic power of the world. And here's what Mitt Romney had to say in a speech back October 8th. I believe that if America does not lead, others will. Others who do not share our interests and our values, and the world will grow darker for our friends and for us. America's security and the cause of freedom cannot afford 4 more years like the last 4 years. I am running for president because I believe the leader of the free world has a duty to our citizens and to our friends everywhere to use America's great influence wisely, with solemnity, and without false pride, but also firmly and actively to shape events in ways that secure our interests, further our values, prevent conflict, and make the world a better place, not perfect, but better. Let's get into this. Wenren Zhang, start us off in Edmonton, Alberta. Does the United States, in your view, still have the capability of remaining the world's lone hyperpower, if you like?
Well, the United States is no longer hyperpower. It is a remaining superpower at the moment, but is in rapid relative decline. To say United States is actually off its military prominence, that's not true. We know it's economically and militarily unrivaled still, even at this moment. But the trajectory into the future, and you're looking at the back, the talk about soft power, the talk about smart power, is something related to the relative decline of the power base of the United States as a superpower as it used to be. But the United States no longer can really put the money where its mouth is. In most of the places around the Asia Pacific, China is by far the largest trading partner with everybody else. And China is the largest trading partner since 2009 with the Africa continent, overtaking the United States. China is going to go overtaking EU in Latin America in terms of both ways of trade in the middle of the decade, and then going towards the United States. We're looking at a world that's changing very rapidly. I think U.S. May realize that. So the Middle Eastern issues, the issues in Asia and around the world, is a reflection of this transition which has been going on for a while.
Malou Innocent, what do you say to that?
I would agree largely. I think that, sort of Governor Romney's positions are certainly much more hawkish. They appear to be much more hawkish. But at least when it comes to economic engagement with the world, economics can be just as important, if not more important in some respects, depending on the region, as much as military power. We've seen the power of China, for instance. It lacks the capability to project its military influence around the world, but it does wield a great deal of cultural and diplomatic and economic influence in various areas of the world, as we saw just recently, in fact, several years ago when President President Obama tried to close Guantanamo Bay, China put up a storm in terms of the European countries that were going to be accepting the Uyghur detainees from Guantanamo. And they sort of just threatened punitive economic retaliation against specific European countries if they decided to accept those Uyghur detainees. That's something that comes with a great deal of political and diplomatic and economic influence, not necessarily brandishing a military threat all the time, whether it's in Africa or in Europe or in the Middle East.
Paul Heinbecker, does the United States, let's say under President Mitt Romney, are they more likely to remain the world's sole superpower and run a more muscular foreign policy that he would like to see?
I think he will try that. I think that's the import of what he's been saying. There's a lot of tone, there's a lot of attitude, but the capability problem remains. Clearly, right now, the United States has 11 aircraft carrier task forces. China has a half of one. It's building one, so militarily, the United States really is without peer. And even with the budget cuts that Romney was complaining about, even with those budget cuts, the United States remains that. But we're looking at also, you have to look at the attitude of the American people. These are not an imperial people, in my judgment at least. I don't think they want to be in the world so much. I don't think that I think they're interested in withdrawing a little bit. You're beginning to see the energy self-sufficiency. That great goal is almost within reach in the United States from shale oil and shale gas. So if you have a country that, and with a little bit of help from its friend Canada, in those circumstances, the United States doesn't have to be in the Middle East. It doesn't have to protect its direct interest. It has an indirect interest in terms of the international economy in it, but it doesn't have to be there. I would not be surprised to see the United States wanting to withdraw from the world more. Not isolationist in the old sense, I think that's not possible. But they don't have to, in Obama's judgment and Hillary Clinton's judgment, they don't have to lead every fight. If there's going to be a fight, they would rather have the Libya model, if they could get it, where somebody else does, they'll contribute and they may do the hardest part at the beginning. But leading from behind. Let somebody else take on the hard work and let the United States, look after its deficit and its debt and get its economy back in shape.
Jeff, what's your view on all that?
I agree. I mean, the key point is, I think, these 11 carrier task forces, right? Unless the European Union starts building aircraft carriers, or China actually starts building them more quickly. I think they do have an aircraft carrier now. What they did is they bought an old Soviet one, right? Yeah. And they just refurbished it, which we during the Cold War would not have considered an aircraft carrier, right? It wouldn't even fit into the category of aircraft carrier.
I hope it works better than our submarines.
Absolutely. But so, I mean, really at this point, but I don't think that should be underplayed. That's a huge element of the global order, right? The fact of the matter is that the United States can send what amounts to these kind of Death Stars throughout the world in order to impose a certain amount of order. Until that's replaced, right? And that's just going to take a very long time. The American population may lose some of its appetite for it, but it also derives tremendous benefits from it as well. It's the order provider, and therefore it gets certain benefits from that order that it provides. And that's still a deal which most Americans will go for. It may change in the future, but it's still a deal they'll go for.
Best Star Wars reference yet on this program.
I've tried.
The Death Star. Nicely done. Don, your view.
Just to get back to the initial quote that you gave from Governor Romney, it's an interesting quote, but it should have been given in 1980. This campaign is so reminiscent of the Carter-Reagan debates because Romney is trying to portray himself as the next Ronald Reagan, that America has been kicked around. It's time for America to reassert itself, both at home and abroad. If you look at the people that Governor Romney has surrounded himself with, the majority are from the Bush years. Some are from the Reagan years.
The zombie cons.
Yes, so he needs to embrace a new political reality. And getting back to your point about hegemonic powers, in order for a hegemon to be successful, it has to be both willing and able to assume global responsibility. The United States has learned over the last number of years that it can ill afford to become involved in every regional conflict.
So it's no longer willing nor able.
Well, it's debatable, but getting back to a point that's been made, it has to pick and choose. And during the vice presidential debates, Paul Ryan was pressed on this. In the event that thousands more die in Syria, would the United States be prepared to engage in a humanitarian relief effort? And his response was, the United States will intervene when its vital national security interests are at stake. You need to define those and understand them. And that's something he did not do.
Did you find that a satisfactory answer?
No, I didn't.
You did not?
No, not at all.
Okay. Let me go to Wenrang in Edmonton and ask you whether you think that, again, there's this expression which has been kicked around a lot, but America's leading from behind under Barack Obama. Do you think that that has allowed other countries to play a more meaningful leadership role in the world in what we think is a more multipolar world right now?
Well, this is getting more multipolar, but the U.S. remains militarily dominant. There's a willingness, who is going to fill in, to be working with the United States. On the Libyan model, the EU countries, NATO coming in, but you know where economically Europe is. Their capabilities are diminishing. Another question is, what about the U.S. other allies? We remember this discussion on hegemonic power decline and stability back in the late 1980s. If this conversation is to occur, people will talk about, let's use Japan. Japan is a U.S. ally. U.S. has a military predominance. Japan has the yen diplomacy and economic power. The two can line up. But now the issue is whether China would be playing that role. The two, one emerging great power, another is sustaining one. Can the two, politically quite different, is not an ally? Can they bridge over their differences? Economically, it's very interdependent. China is the largest creditor of the United States, continue to lend money to the United States. The question is, will we see a model that China is willing to work with the United States, very much benefiting from the current world order and saying they can live with it and support the United States economically and financially in some aspect? That is something I think we need to look at the broader geostrategic dimension with how Americans are going to accommodate the rise of China, which trying to rise peacefully. Historically, this is a very difficult task. And so if China cannot fill in, China is not a candidate, in many ways can fill in. So how can they find a way to work together? I think that's the biggest challenge for the next president.
Well, you have nicely segued us into the final chapter of our discussion here tonight, which we'll now move to China. And we want to, first of all, quote the Sino-sage in Washington. Here's Henry Kissinger. In each country, there are domestic pressures that emphasize disagreements that arise, and we see that in our political campaign, in which both candidates are using language that I find extremely deplorable, Henry Kissinger said during a panel discussion at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington. Both use the word cheat as applied to China in trade, Mr. Kissinger added, saying that theoreticians unschooled in the nuances of the U.S.-China relationship, quote, want to turn this into a crusade. Let's go around on this. There has been a lot of very tough rhetoric, Jeffrey, about China, mostly from the Romney side, I think it's fair to say, in this campaign. What do we think of that?
Well, Romney immediately said that the first thing he would do upon getting elected president was to declare China a currency manipulator and slap 20% tariffs on all its goods, which would, that would be up there with one of the kind of more counterproductive foreign policy moves since the Smoot-Hawley tariff in the 1930s. Why? Well, because China, as one of our guests has already noted, holds a huge amount of U.S. debt. There's not a lot of evidence that China is going to actually try to cash in these bonds and cause some kind of run on the U.S. economy because they're in a love embrace, China and the United States. But even so, it really wouldn't make any sense to declare China a currency manipulator from get-go. It's a lot of overheated rhetoric. I don't think he'd actually follow through on this, by the way. But it's a little bit scary. Both sides, however, both the Romney and the Obama camp are pursuing, and especially Obama, and we know this in Canada, kind of a mild economic nationalism, right, by American. This has affected Canada already, and Canada cares about this a great deal. All countries in the world now are kind of a little bit turned off the global free trade phenomenon from the last, let's say, 25 years, and they're pursuing these kind of mildly nationalist goals. The question is, how far are they going to push this with China? I think they're locked together to really push it too far.
Ambassador Hambecker, what's your view on the level of rhetoric about China in this campaign?
I think we have to recognize that China and the United States are strategic Siamese twins joined at the wallet. They can't.
That's a good line. Where'd you get that? Did you
I
come up
used to
with
be a
that?
speechwriter.
That's
What
good
can I
stuff.
say?
All right. Siamese twins joined at the wallet.
Yeah.
Good one.
They can't afford, neither of them can afford simply to damage the other one because it's self-destructive. So in some ways, that's a very stabilizing situation. And it's something that I think Obama probably instinctively understands, and it's something that Romney is going to have to learn. I don't think that all of this tough talk about China, it's clearly being done for political purposes. It's people are appealing to their base, Obama and co to the unions, Romney to the sort of the populists in his party. They'll have to set that aside pretty smartly because it's just not credible. You can't treat the person you owe all that money to. It's the old story. You owe the bank $1,000. It's your problem. You owe them $1 billion. It's their problem.
Right on. Malou Innocent, what is your view on the? Henry Kissinger called it deplorable. Some of the rhetoric he's heard about China during the course of this presidential campaign.
Well, I would agree with the previous speakers, but I'll add one more element. I mean, there's certainly been a great deal of demagoguery in Washington toward China, especially when it comes to bilateral trade relations. But that said, the economic engagement with China that we've had over the past 30 years since Deng Xiaoping opened China to the world markets, we've seen something that's very sharply at odds with that policy, which is that America seeks to sort of prevent or impede China's growth as a future peer competitor. We saw this recently with President Obama authorizing the deployment of 2,000 U.S. Marines to Darwin. Now, of course, what can you do in terms of with 2,000 Marines there? But it was certainly something that was perceived within China as being inherently provocative. And I'm certainly, if the shoe was on the other foot, if we saw Chinese warships and vessels in the Gulf of Mexico, Americans would go ballistic. So there are certain problems that are in tension with the economic engagement, which I would agree. I think it's been very beneficial for both sides. But as far as Romney and Obama, certainly the rhetoric has been very heated. Both candidates support a rebalance or a pivot to China, to Asia Pacific more broadly, and mainly focused on China. Both candidates endorse strengthening relations with states surrounding China, especially India, as a counterbalance to China. And again, both candidates want to increase U.S. military presence in the Asia Pacific, which after a 10-year and arguably multi-decade preoccupation with the Middle East is something that should be welcomed within Washington to refocus at least our diplomatic attention to China.
Don, what's your view on this?
Well, we've seen it before. We saw it during the Clinton years in the aftermath of Tiananmen Square. And the president at the time saying that if China did not significantly improve its human rights records, the United States wouldn't grant it most favored nation status. Well, we saw how far that went.
Not too far.
Not too far. So the rhetoric is there. I think it's to be expected during the heat of a campaign, but I agree with what's been said in terms of backing off. And I also agree that if China really felt that there'd be serious repercussions a day after President Romney was elected, I can assure you that they would beef up their diplomatic efforts in Washington to make sure that did not happen.
Let me ask Wen Renjiang this, though. We've talked about how this is sort of playing in Peoria, but I wonder how this is playing in, I was going to say Peking to keep the P going, but it's not Peking anymore. But
It's Beijing.
Beijing, of
Yeah.
course. But how's this playing over there?
Yeah, we can go back to the British way of saying it, but that's okay. The Chinese normally take a fairly relaxed attitude during especially the heated, every 4 year once kind of presidential campaign. They kind of used to the rhetorics. China is kind of a ball being kicked around. And then they know also from the experience, every president in recent history, once into the presidency, takes a very serious look and being more pragmatic. And many of the campaign rhetorics simply just gone away. This year, though, it's a little bit different. The Chinese actually, the state Xinhua state-controlled press openly kind of supporting Obama on this. I think what got them off is Romney's rhetoric about this currency manipulating, fairly explicit commitment on the first day of president to name China in that way. That will trigger a trade war. Nobody can win. So therefore, China is looking at this, but more or less, I've been talking to the Chinese side recently. They're still sitting back, and hopefully the Americans will get all excited and then settle down and then form their foreign policy team and then come to the conclusion that Kissinger is right. Don't go extreme.
Now, Ambassador Heimbecker, there may be a changing of the guard in Washington. There will certainly be a changing of the guard in Beijing. We know that they are going through one of those once-a-decade transformations of power. You know, going from the theory that you can't tell the players without a program, we don't really know who the players are going to be in Washington yet. We know how the players are going to be in Beijing, but we don't necessarily know how they're going to react to all of this, do they?
No, one of the things that I think that we should probably take a second to say to ourselves is that, you know, we're living in probably a golden age now. There's a tendency to think that things are tense, things are terrible, you know, upset. Part of that is a 24-hour news cycle. That's watching television, and you know, you're constantly being bombarded, and actually it's with the same story over and over often. But nonetheless, there is a kind of sense that it creeps into people's minds that they're living in a very dangerous age.
What's golden about this age?
We, the people of the world, and particularly Canada, we've never been richer, we've never been healthier, we've never been better educated, we've never been better connected, and we've never been safer than we are now. There's never been a period in time when there have been so few conflicts, and the conflicts have been so little lethal as they are now.
That's the Steven Pinker theory.
Yes, well, it's also the human security theory from the human security studies people at Simon Fraser University. But fundamentally, that's the reality, and that's the reality we're all living. That's the reality the Chinese are living. That's the reality everybody else is living. So, you know, there's a tendency somehow to sort of get caught up in the crisis of it all. But there really are very few crises. There's hardly any conflict going on in the world right now. Number of conflicts have gone down in the last 30 years, have gone down by 80%.
That's not going to sell newspapers, my friend. You know what I'm saying?
No, that's right. But that's what I'm not. But I'm not selling newspapers. I'm just trying to bring us back to put it a little bit in context. Things are not so bad.
Well, let's do that. Malou Innocent, do you think it's fair to say that things are actually way better out there than we think, and as a result, if it's Romney, if it's Obama, it doesn't matter all that much. The world will keep on ticking.
Certainly, I mean, the world has been much better off, thank goodness, because of globalization and enhanced trade and reduction of economic trade barriers. But I think also just to get back what was mentioned previously, and actually the previous discussion about U.S. military power, the United States has a military that's unsurpassed and unparalleled in the world. And I think we also need to step back and understand that we are safer around the world, but we can actually allow other powers who do have an incentive to keep the economic engines of the world going, to allow them to bear a greater share of the burden militarily and in terms of defense of their own capabilities. There's very little reason why the United States needs to keep over 28,000 troops on the Korean Peninsula. There's very little reason why the United States needs to keep tens of thousands of U.S. troops in Europe. You know, Russia is not going to overrun Western Europe anytime soon. So I think the United States needs to become more discriminating in its grand strategy, even as we accept that the globalization that we've had over the past 30, 50 years has been incredibly enhanced our well-being, our way of life, our safety, our food security. And it's time to begin to step back. Everything is not going to unravel if the United States assumes fewer burdens. I think things will actually enhance for the American people and for the world.
Wenren Zhang, let me bring it back to China and ask you this. Yeah. There is an imminent changing of the guard in China. There may be in the United States. Is that more dangerous is not the right word, but let's say uncertain. Is it more uncertain to the agenda of the world if there's new leadership in Washington and new leadership in China at the same time?
It is more uncertain for sure. The Chinese new leadership, Xi Jinping, Li Keqiang, who are coming in next month, are virtually untested in foreign policy areas. They will have a lot of continuity. They will have the guidance of President Hu Jintao, Premier Wen Jiabao from behind scenes, and they will test out the new U.S. president, whomever he is. But the latest trend, we can talk about we're, yes, in a better world historically, but the trend is not looking very good in terms of U.S.-China relations. Protectionism is on the rise. All the rhetorics, remember this, the China alarm raised by the United States Congress and other politicians is not just U.S. phenomenon. It's been around the world. In this country, the Chinese oil company CNOOC trying to buy Nexen is 1% of Canada's oil production, 3% of Canada's oil reserve. See the firestorm, where it is heading. It's getting into xenophobic scale of panicking. we have to look at how to manage this relationship. I think the Chinese will have this military getting stronger. The Americans will not easily withdraw from the rest of the world. The new leadership in Beijing would not want to show it's weak. So Chinese nationalism is on the rise, pretty ugly recently. Some of the demonstrations against the Japanese. And the Japanese are on the right side, rising, trying to settle some of the island disputes before China got too strong. So there's incentives from all parties around trying to settle, trying to kind of deal with China's rise in a very uncertain manner.
Okay, we've got about 2.5 minutes left here, which gives each of you 30 seconds to tell us who you think the world, writ large, is hoping wins the election in November. Okay, Don, who does the world want, Obama or Romney?
Well, I think in 2008, most world leaders wanted Obama to win, and I suspect that they still would like to see him serve a second term. I think Romney is seen as being too unpredictable. I think they embrace Obama's more multilateral approach and fear that Romney could engage in unilateral action.
Malou Innocent, who does the world want to see win?
I would say it's mixed. It depends on the region, it depends on the country, but overall I would agree. I would say that most foreign leaders would like President Obama to be in the Oval Office. And that said, as I mentioned earlier, I think he's incredibly hawkish in certain areas, so I think compared to Romney, Obama just offers a better packaging in the sense that he is for multilateralism and he is for a rules-based diplomatic engagement with the rest of the world, but he has embraced and expanded and exceeded a lot of the Bush-era policies. So I think in terms of packaging it matters more for Obama, but in terms of substance, there's very little discernible difference on the issues.
Wen Zhang, who does the world want to win?
Well, I think people are looking at this, especially from Asia. They are just keep wait and see attitude. Obama is not the 4 years ago Obama anymore. What his new policy team looks like when Hillary Clinton is gone. So you can say based on past 4 years, yes, I think clearly they probably want continuity in Obama, but they're not sure on what the new policy orientation might be with the second term.
Paul Heinbecker.
I think you have to make a distinction between domination and leadership. I think the world is happy to have American leadership on certain issues some of the time. The world's not happy to have the United States making all of the decisions all of the time. And I think in the attitudes of Obama and Romney, one of them is much more interested in working with others, with multilateralism, with cooperation. The other one is very much in the Bush mode of the United States is going to make the decisions, the United States is going to lead and others will follow, and the world wants us to lead. If you look at what's going on in the Middle East, it's not so obvious that the world wants the American leadership that much.
Last 30 to you, Jeff Copsey.
Obama. I mean, I hate to. It doesn't make for interesting television, I guess, to agree with everybody. But that's just the way it is. I mean, if you look at this foreign country where we are right now, in Canada, I mean, it's clear it's something 75% of the population. He's Canada's president, and but that's not
down,
true.
Though.
It is a bit down.
It was 90 in 2008,
especially with the trade issues. But if you look at other countries in the world, it varies strongly by country. There are a small list of countries. Of course, Israel's one of them where Romney would be much more popular, precisely because he says there's been no daylight not only between Netanyahu but between any Israeli prime minister. So that's just the way it is. In most countries in the world, it's Obama, but in a very few, it's Romney.
The correct answer, of course, is William Jefferson Clinton. Just thought I'd let you all know. I want to thank all of our guests for participating tonight. Wen Zhang in Edmonton, Alberta. It's good of you to join us from the Asia Pacific Foundation. Malou Innocent, first time on the program. Thank you for joining us from the American Capital. You're with the Cato Institute. Here in our studio, Paul Heinbecker, the former UN ambassador, now with CIGI and the Laurier Center for Global Relations. Don Abelson from Western University, which I'm still getting used to.
Me too.
And Jeffrey Kopstein from the U of T Center for Jewish Studies. Good to have all of you on the program tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.